I have a lot of creepy and weird stories, but this is by far my friend's favorite, and the most legit creepy thing I can think of that's happened to me. About 8 years ago, I started going to community college, which meant I had long days and classes at random times. When I got home from school, I would always park my car on the church parking lot next to my house. I lived in a small house behind my parents at the time. One day, I noticed there was a man sitting in this green SUV parked a few cars over from mine around 9 p.m. when I got home. I thought it was weird because no one parked there at night, as it was in the middle of the suburbs, but I figured that it was likely a one-time thing and just forgot about it. The next day, I got home around 2 p.m. and the car was in the exact same spot, with the guy just sitting there doing nothing. I thought that it was weird that he was there again, but just went to my house and watched TV for a while. I then got a call from my friend down the road, asking if I wanted to go on a drive, so I left to go pick her up. I noticed that the guy was still there, still in his car. He was still there when I got back, too. And this went on for a couple of weeks. He was there every day at all hours, morning, day, and night. He would be there until 4 a.m. some nights. I started to get really weirded out by this, because there were probably 50 or more spaces to park in, and he was always 3 spaces away from mine. He knew I parked there, as I was the only car that parked there because there was a gate to my house and the fence across from my normal spot. It was very unnerving that he was always there. Finally, one day I came home, and the guy wasn't there, so I decided to park in the spot he was always in. It didn't seem special. There were no extra trees in the spot, and it faced the fence. There were hills on the other side, which were much prettier and more scenic to look at. Once I parked, I stayed for a few minutes and called one of my friends. But finally, I noticed something horrifying. I could see into every window in my house. I didn't have curtains at the time, and had a pretty stupid habit of walking around in my underwear. I mean, I had a huge fence there, and there was no way to see into my house from the street. I freaked out, and realized that he had been watching me. I took my parents' Mastiff, and made him stay with me at nights after that. I also stopped parking in the church parking lot, unless it was during the day, and parked in the lot even though I had to open a huge gate manually to get in, and then close it for the dogs. I told my dad, but he thought I was being crazy and paranoid. But my mom, she believed me. One day, we got in her truck and drove behind the guy's car to get his license plate number. He got really angry with us, stormed out of his car and yelled at us. My mom basically said, "You're really creepy. You can see into my daughter's house, and you're here all of the time, day and night." He said he was cooling down before he went home after he went to the gym. It made no sense. We called the police and they went to his house. It turned out he was a married dude with kids, and he told them he was just listening to his tapes. I had actually snuck along the fence where he couldn't see me at one point, and just listened to what he was doing as his windows were down. He was sitting in silence. There were no tapes, and I never heard them. The police told him that he would be in serious trouble if they found him parked there again, and that he basically wasn't allowed back there. I know the police get a lot of shit sometimes, but they were great during this incident, and they scared him. The next day, he wasn't around, and I thought that it was over. It was also my friend's birthday, so I went out to dinner that night. I came home around 11 p.m., and there was another car parked in the same spot. I was livid. I knew it was him, but a different car. I told my mom and then just stayed at my parents' because I was pretty freaked out. My mom decided to drive her car through the parking lot to see if he was still there. When she drove through with the brights on, she saw that no one was in the car. She figured it was a coincidence and drove past, and then turned the car around. When she turned the car around though, she saw a man get up from a crouched position and then speed out. Apparently, she thought to herself this was a prime opportunity to follow him. He was going 70 miles per hour on a residential road and went through a few different streets trying to lose my mom. Eventually, he went onto the main road and there was a red light. My mom pulled up next to him, and he pulled his sweatshirt over his face and covered himself with his arms so she couldn't see him. He may have thought it was my dad, who is huge and is an ex-NFL player, and is pretty intimidating looking. Once it turned green, he sped off again, and after about 10 minutes finally lost my mom. She immediately called the police, and they told her that it was very suspicious, and that she should probably leave chases up to the police next time. After that, the man never came back, and I got curtains. To this day, I still don't know what his intentions were. I had a huge-ass 170-pound Mastiff, who was friendly with most people, but was very protective of me, and it was really obvious. I also had a brother who was a double state championship winning hockey player, and a huge dad. But it seemed the only person who intimidated him was my mom. I was a young and naive youth minister, working at my first job at a church. I was very eager to know my kids and their parents. I made a pretty active program, and we were attracting new kids every day. One day, the single father and a little boy show up. Okay, seems pretty normal. The dad is a big guy, not fat, just overall pretty big. But he was just sort of creepy looking. He was missing some teeth, and he didn't show up much, so it flagged my attention. The little boy was a troublemaker. His first day there, he was already pushing other kids down. He was a bully that had some serious issues. The dad also had some sob story about how he just left his wife and she was abusive. The little boy starts to show up to youth events, and so does his dad. One day, I'm sitting in my office, alone, and I hear something in the copy room. I don't think anything of it, because we keep our door locked and you have to have a key or be buzzed in to get inside. I assume someone with a key is in, maybe the other minister. After a few minutes though, I hear a kid's voice, so I step outside into the lobby area. There's the creepy dad and the boy. They're going through the cabinets in the office. I have no idea how they got in here, so I hold my cell phone and stay in the lobby with them. I say that I'm about to run some errands, and that I have to arm the office so they would have to leave. In reality, I was going to take a trip around the building to get rid of them. It's an ethics policy to not be alone with congregants in the building, as a protection for not only the congregants, but the ministerial staff as well. I was going to do anything to get them to leave. As we leave, they go out one door and I go out the other. I have my phone ready in my hand whilst in the car, and the creepy dad starts knocking on my car window. I had an older car without power windows at the time, so I reach over and roll down the window a little bit. He wants to know if I would babysit his kid someday. He said he left the kid alone last week, and the kid had peed all over the apartment, so he was looking for a babysitter that would be a good influence on him. I told him that I couldn't do that. I had other obligations and had no room to fit that into my schedule. He sat trying to open my door for a few minutes, then trying to push the barely open window down, begging me to babysit before I said that I really had to run an errand at that moment. He finally leaves me, and I drive away. I knew he would be there for a while waiting for me to return, so I go get an iced tea and a snack at my favorite fast food joint. I drive back to the church, and he's still there. I call one of the older people that I knew lived close by. He agreed to meet me by the church, but by the time we both got there, the creepy dad and the kid were gone. The next week, I hear them in the office again. I still have no idea how they were getting in the office or what they were looking for. This time, he's come to tell me that he DVR'd a special about Jesus, and he wants to invite me over to talk about it and eat dinner. He said he would even buy wine. I just told him no, that's not something I would do. He then invites the youth group to come over to his apartment and watch the Jesus movie. I suggested that we could watch the Jesus movie if it was at the church, but that was all. He got pretty agitated at that point. It was about this time I started getting weird text messages. I would get text messages that said, "You look so pretty today," and "I like that blue shirt," almost every day. Mind you, I wasn't at the church every day. I started putting things together when one Sunday morning, I was using my cell phone in the front of the church for a children's message when it started to ring. It was the number I had been getting text messages from. I had never responded to the number, so I just ignored it. He kept calling it and laughing in the back of the church. He later said that it was him who had pranked me in the church, so I knew where the texts were coming from, and I knew he was watching me when I wasn't at church. About a month later, the text messages were starting to get a little more perverse. I was getting texts from my secret admirer, and graphic details of our date he had imagined in his head and was planning for us. I had mentioned the text to my male supervisor a few weeks before, and he suggested I responded that I'm not interested. My professor at my seminary, on the other hand, said to completely ignore the messages, which I had been doing. Well, this pissed off the creepy dad. The messages started getting aggressive, like, "If you don't reply, you'll regret it." A few weeks later, I was at summer camp with kids at this point, and a fellow female minister looked at me while I was crying about this, and basically said that this guy was a perv, and I needed to get rid of him. We had a co-minister who was a male call the guy and tell him to stop or I would press charges. And the creepy dad then went and complained about me to the church board, saying I was leading him on and I was the one sending him the perverted and graphic texts. He had imagined I was flirting with him while at church when I talked to him and his kid, when in reality it was just my job. It was at this point that the senior minister actually listened to me, read the messages that I had been forwarding to him, and was shocked about what was going on. My supervisor didn't believe me at first, saying that sexual assault doesn't happen in church from a congregant to a minister. It was at this point, whenever I did something in the service like pray or preach, the creepy dad would walk at and stare at me from a window outside until my part was done. Then he would return to the sanctuary. It was at this point that a congregation member who was friends with the lady minister above put things together, and that he wasn't just sending me messages, but also to 5 other ladies at the church. As things turned out, he was going around to various churches in the area, preying on the single women in the congregation, and using his kid as bait to get sympathy so he could have sex with them. It turned into a huge fiasco, because the church didn't want to ask him to leave, since it was open to everyone, but we had a predator in the congregation that made many people feel uncomfortable. He ended up having to move because of his job, but I'm still creeped out by him to this day. This happened when I was a kid, living in La Mesa, California. I was 5 to 7 years old, I think. We belonged to a moderately large Protestant church, with a cheerful congregation, and all of the families were tight-knit. But there were plenty of non-regulars who stopped by. I've always been a very willful person, with a bit of an invincibility complex and a feverish curiosity. As a little girl, you couldn't tell me not to go somewhere before finding that I was already there. I loved exploring and being alone, and this story is about the day when I realized that might not always be the best idea. It's hard to explain how stubborn I am in general, and my parents had noted this and always tried to communicate concepts of danger and fear to me, but it just didn't make a lot of sense to me. If something was scary, then you should confront it and fight it. That was my motto, I guess, at 6-ish years old. I had run along cliffs and swam out farther than I was supposed to where riptides were known to happen, and played in the street and went looking for strangers to meet. You can imagine my poor mother. But this day was the first time in my life that I had ever really felt a pang of real danger, or a tiny thrill of concern that something very bad might be about to happen. When the church would let out on Sundays, everyone would proceed to the courtyard or the offices, or maybe the kitchens to help, and no one remained in any part of the sanctuary after some minutes. Since I was stuck waiting for my parents to leave, I liked to wander around up in the balcony where the choir would sing, and play with the organ where there was stained glass. Sometimes I would sneak around in the back, trying to get out onto the roof, or playing where the vestments were kept. And there was a behind-the-scenes area separated by doors from the elevated front of the sanctuary, and I had just been poking around in there when I decided to leave and heard someone call to me. I turned around and saw this guy, maybe 20s to 30s, stringy blondish hair, clothing kind of indicative of a disorganized mind. Not a homeless person, but casual and abused enough that even a younger me recognized that this guy was a little different. He greeted me warmly as though we were good friends. I recognized that I had met him once before in this very same room. He had introduced himself to me as people from the choir walked around us to put their things away. He had seemed a bit flustered at the time and mostly made small talk about things, and then I left. I didn't remember his name or anything about him really, but I greeted him and was polite. There was no one else back here. The door on the other side was locked, I knew, so I wondered how he had gotten behind me without my noticing. I had gone all the way around when I first came in, hadn't I? And there hadn't been anyone else in there. It didn't make a lot of sense. He asked me if everything was okay, and I told him yes, but I had to go. He said, "Wait a minute, don't you want to hear how I'm doing?" I said yes, but that my parents were waiting for me, which was kind of a lie. The guy proceeded to say that he was fine, then asked me for a hug, already coming in for one. I said okay because it was clearly going to happen anyway, and I didn't yet want him to realize how opposed to the idea of being near him I was. Now I wished that someone was here, anyone else, but especially another adult. I started to think about how unlikely it was that anyone would ever come in here, how far away everyone was, how even though the sanctuary had good acoustics and the front wasn't all that far away, no one would hear me if I yelled. He hung on to me in the hug for a very, very long time. It felt like minutes were going by. Now I knew that something was definitely wrong about this. I said, "Okay, well, sorry, but I have to go." I felt him begin to let go, but then pause. Goosebumps, and not the good kind. I stepped back and he finally let go, but the look in his eyes was different, as though he knew what I was thinking and feeling, and that I was lying to him, and that I didn't want to be there anymore. His eyes kind of slitted as he looked down at me. He was obviously considering something. I smiled, trying to be as convincing as I could, hoping I could make him believe that I was having a good time, and that he should keep playing his previous game. I didn't understand the situation in full at the time, but the basics of the animalistic behavior at play made sense to me. After a moment of silence, I said, wishing I trusted myself to remember his name, "Nice to see you. Hopefully I see you next week when we're not leaving. Bye." I smiled big and looked him directly in the eyes as I did so, then turned around to ascend the few steps it took to get out the door and into the sanctuary. I could feel him watching, still considering something. Trying not to run, those few seconds slowed down in my mind and were some of the slowest in my life. I think. Every instant, I thought he was going to grab me and pull me back down into the room. When I hit the sanctuary, after a few steps I skipped fast for the rest of the way, and finally hit the doors, back out into the sound of all the people talking, and the bright sunlight. Good evening, all. I have an unhealthy addiction to this subreddit, and all accounts real and creepy. I can't stop reading these once I start, seriously. Anywho, I thought I would share one of my own. My mother is an intensely devout Catholic, and has been since my very early childhood. She's always been extremely active as well, participating in various forms of worship organized by mainstream and not-so-mainstream Catholic sects. Most of my most bizarre memories involve my mother and these activities and those people. As a child, I was told the Virgin Mary presented herself to me in a vision. Another time, I was told that I was an agent of the devil in front of a church full of my peers. Needless to say, I'm no longer very religious. However, as a young child, I didn't have a choice in the matter, and my mother brought me along to most of her church activities. This incident occurred when I was in kindergarten, so I was 5 or 6. My mother formed part of the church choir and had weekly practice on a weekday at around 6 p.m. or so. Normally, there were 1 or 2 other kids my age, and we'd just play outside the practice room in the church parking lot. On this particular day, no other kids had been brought, which happened occasionally, but as a little kid, the only playmate I needed was my imagination. Rehearsal had been going on for a while, and I was standing right outside the door. I knew I had to stay close by, and my mom had told me to stay on the sidewalk. When a slightly run-down-looking pickup truck pulled into the parking lot, and, strangely, parked right in the middle with the driver's side door towards me. The man inside the truck opened his door, and without getting out, began speaking to me. I think he was 30 to 50. Hard to tell at that age. All adults are of an age to a kid. Also, it's been 20 years and the details are a little bit fuzzy. Well, he started talking to me, but since he had stopped in the middle of the parking lot, I didn't understand what he was saying. He was probably some 15 feet away from the sidewalk. I just assumed he probably wanted to ask for another adult, so I walked close enough to hear him. I live in Puerto Rico, so the following exchange is my translation from Spanish. "Hey, are you bored?" he asked, smiling. I automatically got a little wary of that. I'd been taught stranger danger, so I hung back. But I was actually bored at that point, so I told him yes. "Want to go home with me and play some games? Your dad told me to come pick you up. Come on." He was still smiling and sitting back in the driver's seat. He looked relaxed and friendly enough to me. I really wanted to go back to my house too, so his offer actually sounded good. I lived pretty close, so I thought maybe my dad actually had sent this guy. Something about him was making me nervous though, but I was still considering it. I walked a bit closer to the truck, paused, and asked, "Whose house?" "Mine." I ran. I knew he was lying. My parents would never have let me go to someone else's house. It was something I had been scolded on before. I turned and ran into the practice room and just clutched my mother until it was time to go. To this day, it makes my stomach turn to imagine what would have happened if things had played out differently. Had I gotten into that truck, I would have most likely disappeared and never been found. And the guilt would have destroyed my mother, and likely the lives of my older brother and father. My little brother may not have even been born. I'm so thankful for that alarm that went off in my head and told me to run. What's up, guys? Blue Spooky here, as always. I just wanted to thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it to the end of the video here. If you liked the video, please feel free to leave a comment, or like and share if you feel so inclined. If you have any stories you'd like me to read, or any personal stories you'd like to send in, please feel free to take a look in the description below. There will be links to all of my social media, including Facebook, Twitter, and Gmail. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to include your story in a video as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please feel free to include in the tagline what the story is about and how you'd like to be credited in the description of the video that this story appears in. If you have any constructive criticism, please feel free to leave it in the comments below, as I'm always looking for new ways to improve the channel. In addition, I'd like to note that I've been receiving a lot of questions involving what the music I use in my videos are, so I'm just going to say right now that the tracks I use are by an artist named Muji, and all tracks used in the videos are listed in the description in the order in which they appear in the video, and they're all named by name. So if you guys are curious about what the music is, just go ahead and check down there in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.